Lovely. Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon to everyone. Give me a shout, Mark, if at any time presentation stops, I freeze or what have you.
Yeah.
So today we're going to be covering biodiversity net gain. My name's Oliver Silver. I'm the head of ecology at Ground Control. And biodiversity net gain is actually quite a confusing topic, and it's a confusing term as well that not many people understand very well, and that includes ecologists as well. So the first thing that we're going to cover is, what is it? We just want to find out what biodiversity net gain, what that term actually means. So Tony Juniper, who's the head of Natural England, he recently gave a speech at our Green Gains event last year. And he said in that speech, during a recent study of the British public, when asked, what is biodiversity, the leading response was laundry detergent. So people literally think that biodiversity at that time was laundry detergent. So our mission today is to try and change those statistics and really just get to the bottom of what this term biodiversity net gain means. And to do that, we're going to break down each word in turn. And we're going to understand what sort of the root meaning is for each of those. And then once we understand that, we can move on to why we apply it and sort of why it's good for ecology and humanity at large. So if you're making notes today, and you should be making notes, the first thing you want to write down is that biodiversity net gain is not laundry detergent. Okay. It sounds like laundry detergent. To be fair, biodiversity sounds like laundry detergent, but it's actually not. And so hopefully by the end of this, you'll be able to answer that question quite confidently. Now let's start with the first word in that term, biodiversity. So this is a portmanteau of the words biological and diversity. All right. So biological referring to all living things, namely plants and animals, and diversity alluding to differences between those living things. And as we'll come to find out, diversity is a good thing. So as an example, there are approximately 400,000 species of beetle on Earth. So you could say that beetles are the most biologically diverse group of insects on Earth. Yeah, that's something that we want to aim for. That's one of the aims of biodiversity net gain. Now, if we move on to the term net. So the term net is a term borrowed from economics. And you probably know the terms gross profit, net profit. And the same definition applies here, but I want to just sort of like hammer this home with what I call the cheeseburger example, so you really understand what it is when we say net. What do we mean by that? Well, let's imagine for a second that now you're all cheeseburger salesmen and women, right? And you sell a cheeseburger for £1, right? So that £1 is your revenue, right? But it costs you 20p in ingredients, right, to make the cheeseburger. So now your gross profit is 80p. But we're actually interested in this net term. So net is what's happened once all the losses have been accounted for. So in the cheeseburger example, it could be that you've got to pay your staff, you've got to pay rent for the building and stuff like that. And that's what we're interested in. We're interested in that final net term rather than like gross profit or net profit, for example. So what does biodiversity look like once all the losses have been taken into account? Now, an example of this might be felling trees on site. So a client might ask us to look at their development proposals, and we've got to factor in, tree felling, which is a loss, but there's other ways which you can lose in terms of biodiversity on site. That might be creating or moving habitats might be another example of that, where it's actually ends up being a loss. So that's that net term. And then gain, the term gain, or the word gain, can be taken at face value. So it's synonymous with the word increase. So we've got, so if we sort of like rejumble biodiversity net gain, if we rejumble these words and like try and formulate a question, the question could be, what is the increase in biological diversity once everything has been accounted for? That's the sort of question you should be asking yourself when you're looking at biodiversity net gain. So it's an increase in biological diversity. And now that we understand what it is, an increase in principle, an increase in biological diversity, we now need to understand under what circumstances or situations we might use it. So biodiversity net gain is typically used in development scenarios. So for example, our clients may wish to build a shopping mall, say in the middle of a farmer's field. So as ecologists, we can apply this biodiversity net gain idea to the shopping mall proposal and inform our client what the results of building that said shopping mall would be for biodiversity. So that's where we use it. We typically use it in development sort of scenarios. And the final question is how? How is biodiversity net gain calculated? So this part gets a little bit more complicated, but for those that are interested, essentially what we do is we assign habitats, like our farmer's field, a value based on a bunch of different factors. So things like we want to know how rare the habitat is, we want to know what the size of the habitat parcel is, and its condition as well. And in the farmer's field example, that let's say that the grassland habitat on that parcel is probably not particularly rare, so it probably doesn't score that well for that aspect. But normally farmers' fields are quite large, so it's going to score quite well in terms of hectares. And the condition is probably not going to be great because it's probably going to be regularly managed and things like that. So conditions probably poor, and all these things combine to make a particular value for that field. So that's where our expert ecologists at Ground Control come in, and some of them are sitting on this call and smiling, and they can wave, so you know who they are, and you can send them inquiries after this call. They undertake these assessments. So the name of the assessment in a nutshell is UKHAB classification. They're the guys that are going out on site. They are mapping these habitats. They're recording, what sort of species they are. They're doing that sort of habitat classification, and they're also recording condition. And we plug all those values into a giant spreadsheet, basically, provided by Natural England, called the Biodiversity Metric Calculator, that allows us to calculate the biodiversity net gain for a site. So finally, what is biodiversity net gain? It's also an equation. And it's important that it is an equation, because there is a certain threshold that needs to be met in terms of biodiversity net gain, which is 10%, a 10% increase. So there we go. Now you can confidently answer the question, what is biodiversity net gain? It's not laundry detergent. It is an increase in biological diversity, and it is an equation, which we use to get there. Lovely. Slide 2 of 3, almost there. So now that we know what biodiversity is, we need to understand, why is biodiversity good? Why is this a good thing? So to understand why biodiversity is good, we can ask the question, what is the opposite? We can ask the inverse. What is the opposite of biological diversity? And the answer is sameness or homogeneous habitats and species. So this is generally considered a bad thing. Inbreeding is an example of this. So when individuals of the same species are too similar, genetically speaking, it leads to negative outcomes. We'll use dogs as a scenario. So we know that, for example, the higher degree of inbreeding in dogs, the higher the risk is of puppies developing genetically inherited disorders. And inbreeding can also negatively impact litter size and fertility and stuff like that. So that's one of the reasons why diversification is a good thing. Another example might be where you have monocultures like corn, right? So you see a field of corn crops. Every single corn that you see in that crop is genetically identical. And there's a disadvantage with that, because if a disease or a pathogen moves in on that corn crop, if it kills one of the corn crops, it's likely going to spread throughout the entire monoculture and kill them all, because they're genetically identical. So that's another example where genetic diversity isn't always advantageous. Okay. Right. And then the second point to this, so that was quite a defensive reason. The second point is a bit more positive, I guess, and harder to deny, which is, are you pro humanity? Because biodiversity is, if you're pro biodiversity, you're pro the human race, which I think everyone on this call probably is. And this second point can't really be emphasized strongly enough. Essentially, the proper functioning of ecosystems, which includes healthy biodiversity, healthy levels of biodiversity, bleeds into every aspect of our lives, from the air we breathe to the food we eat. Someone in the office recently asked me, so what do wasps do? What's their role? And admittedly, I didn't actually know the answer to that, so I looked it up. And surprisingly, wasps are one of the key pollinators for cider production. So they provide the essential function of pollination for the fruit that then becomes our cider. So if you like biodiversity, then you should also like cider, right? So and this is true for almost every process which involves food production and stuff like that. So really obvious reasons to be on board with biodiversity. And we can say, the greater the biological diversity, the healthier these ecosystems are. And this is a great outcome for everyone who sits in that pro-humanity camp, which I know you'll be on. Now, I want to talk about both sides of the coin, because I don't want to just give you a biased sort of argument, and I don't think I've heard anyone talk about potential downsides to biodiversity net gain. I had to spitball some myself prior to this. So let's look at some potential downsides. So imagine biodiversity net gain is working well. We're improving biodiversity everywhere throughout England, and habitats are thriving, and so are animals. Imagine a resurgence of an animal species that has previously been in decline. So imagine adders suddenly in every backyard in England. Would you be happy with this? Some people would be, others really wouldn't be. Or imagine a swarm of mosquitoes emerging en masse from all the wildlife ponds we've created from our biodiversity net gain efforts. And actually, ponds score really, really highly in terms of habitats that we can suggest to our clients to create under the biodiversity net gain metric. So, you know, this is obviously these are hypothetical sort of scenarios, but the point being is there may be unintended consequences to biodiversity net gain, which we'll have to deal with in the future if our B&G mission is successful. I do want to shed some positive light to this situation and just sort of propose that if we are faced with a sort of apocalyptic sort of levels of mosquitoes, we can still use biodiversity net gain solutions to overcome these. So this could be installing bat boxes on every building to combat the sort of mosquito problem, because we know that a single bat in UK species as well can eat over 3,000 tiny insects in one night, which obviously includes mosquitoes. So maybe we fight fire with fire. So that's why biodiversity is good. Last slide. What can we do? Okay. So, you know, because you're all, you know, good intention ground control staff, I know that you want to go over and above, and you want to help as well, which is great. The good news is that the government has passed the Environment Act 2021, which basically mandates that all planning permission applications in England must deliver a 10% biodiversity net gain. And these net gain solutions must also be secured for the next 30 years. So the government has got it sorted. For some extra context, there's no credit-based system currently in Wales or Scotland. They are still sort of using older methods, but rest assured, planning policy within those respective nations means that developers are still encouraged to conserve and enhance biodiversity wherever possible. And sometimes positive sort of net gain solutions or positive solutions for biodiversity rather are still achieved. But it's just the difference is with biodiversity net gain, it's very black and white. Either you achieve a 10% net gain or you don't. And if you don't, then there's consequences to that, which maybe a development is not permitted. Okay, so you can all sleep easy knowing that the government's got it sorted. But you're probably sitting here thinking, great, but I still want to help. So what can I do? So, which is great. And there are what we call nature positive solutions that you can implement at home. And these sort of typically sit outside. At the moment, they sit outside of what we would input into the metric, but undoubtedly, it's a positive thing that you can do to support the cause. The first one is No Mow May. So this is an initiative coined by an organization called Plant Life, and the idea is simple. Pollinator species like bees and butterflies, they rely on pollen as a food source. So if you mow your lawns at home less regularly, especially in May when wildflowers are in bloom, you can actively improve biodiversity net gain in your own backyard. You are effectively providing a food source for those insects. So consider that. It's a free option. You might also think to yourself, well, actually, practically that doesn't work for me because I like to keep my yard nice and tidy. No worries. Mow the center of your lawn and leave the boundaries to sort of bloom and go rank, and that will provide a benefit of sorts. So best of both worlds there. Okay, and secondly, you can install bat boxes, bird boxes, and insect hotels. These are things that we recommend anyway as ecologists in our technical reports, but there's no reason that you can't do this in your own home if you wish to. So the side of buildings, garden sheds, or trees in your backyard are sort of great places to install these things. Bird and bat boxes start at around 30 quid. And all you've got to do is put them at a height of around 3 meters, so they're sufficiently away from predators and things like that, and then just leave them be. And what this does is this provides more shelter and breeding places for these animals, which improves the proper functioning of our shared ecosystem. So there you go. There's 2 things that you can do right now at home to improve biodiversity. Lovely. With that, I trust that you can now all confidently answer the question, what is biodiversity net gain? And I've given you some practical ideas about how you can improve it at home. And I thank you for your time. And now I'll just open up the floor to questions. Yeah, now I can see you all again.
Thanks, Oliver. Yeah, if there are any questions, if you want to drop them in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand, you're more than welcome to. Got a few minutes left. We need to finish up.
Surely there must be one.
Not one question. No one wants to jump in. Well, we've got hands up from Adam.
Oliver, thanks for that. I now love wasps. Though
yeah, same.
But they seem to like my cider more than I do. They seem to get in it quicker than I can. In terms of when you mentioned actually the downside sides, like more insects, more wasps, more adders, the things like that. When we are proposing these to customers, do we, 1, highlight them, or 2, do we advise them on how best to manage anything like this should it happen? Do you know what I mean? Because sometimes it'd be quite a good value to go, you need to understand some of the ramifications of what you're doing, because otherwise down the line we might end up with a pub chain ringing us up saying everyone's got wasps in the cider.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we actually had this example just recently with a client who Green King, who manages a series of pubs and things like that. And just through conversation with the client, we understood their needs, which is they don't want loads of wasps and insects and things like this. So we've avoided including those as part of our sort of nature positive solutions in our report. And I would just say, look, everything is case by case, but yes, definitely have those conversations and don't just ask, do you want to achieve 10% net gain as a minimum, but what things are you looking to avoid such that we can work the best possible solution for you?
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Ellie, will I go next?
Yeah, mine was just the question that I put on the chat about holes in fences for hedgehogs. Does that really help? Does that help them move about? Are they? I mean, I'm on a new estate. I haven't seen a single hedgehog here, so it's a bit of a shame. But yeah, do they move that far?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that comes down to sort of like habitat connectivity. So we're always trying to improve connectivity for different animal species. In the case of bats and things like that, if we've got like linear habitats like hedgerows or lines of trees, and we notice there's a significant gap in those, we might recommend planting those up such that the animals will then recognize and use those commuting corridors or foraging corridors. And it's the same thing with hedgehog. They may get stuck within one particular area, one particular backyard or what have you. And if we can just add, I think they call them hedgehog highways, which is just essentially cutting the bottom 6 inches out from a panel of wooden fencing, that allows animals like hedgehogs to move through and forage more effectively, and it's always going to be a benefit for biodiversity at large. So yeah, that is something else that you can do.
Oh, thank you.
Justine.
Oliver, if somebody lived in an apartment, what would be the one thing they could do on a balcony or a windowsill that would have the most impact for pollinators or kind of increasing biodiversity?
Good question. Good question. Might need some help from the crowd here with my expert ecologist. I'm trying to think. I mean, look, we still recommend green roofs, right? So green roofs is an idea where you literally put a lawn on top of or a wildflower meadow on top of a building. So the height of those habitats isn't absolutely essential unless you're talking about sort of skyscraper type levels. So yeah, any sort of like fruiting plant, anything that has a flower, wildflowers, anything like that with pollen is going to attract insects. It's going to be a food source. It's going to be a positive for biodiversity. So yeah, flowering species, maybe even small fruiting trees and things like that. Food source is going to be a good thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. I think we've got Philip in the chat said, do you think May should be moved to April, which I think is probably about the May, if I'm saying that right.
I'm going to stick to the plant life guidance on this one and say May. On their website as well, they were trying to extend it into let it bloom June as well, but I thought I'd leave that out because it's about 2 months of no mowing is just ridiculous. So they're going to pick one. So let's keep it to May. There's alliteration there. People can remember it. And I think the reason is because, yeah, that must be when the most number of wildflowers are in bloom. So I think let's stick to May.
Excellent. Well, if there are no more questions, I think we'll wrap up there since we're getting close to time. Thanks very much, Oliver. That was really good. This will be recorded and put on our YouTube channel for anyone who hasn't been able to attend. You can share it with your teams, and we'll post a link to that in the chat later on. But thanks very much, and we'll see you next week.
Much appreciated. Cheers, guys.
Thanks, everyone.